when the common accessory you just bought turns out to not be so common after all. On this episode of Toy Train Tips and Tricks. Hello again, this is Mike. Sometimes what at first appears to be a very common piece leads you down unexpected paths and turns out to be not quite as common as you think. And that is the case with this rotating aircraft beacon accessory. These were very popular accessories, and at least 4 O and S scale manufacturers made these from 1949 through the 1960s, and of course many reproductions have been made since then. I had been looking for a tower such as this for my layout when I came across this particular one at a train show back in the fall. It was in need of some TLC. The beacon itself was missing a vane on top and the bulb was missing, but these parts are readily available because these pieces are so common, so I wasn't too concerned about that. But there was just something unusual about this tower. I could tell by its plastic construction that it wasn't a Lionel piece, but there were no other identifying markings, so I really couldn't tell who did make it or when. But we'll get back to that in a moment.
In the early 1920s, aircraft beacons like these were popping up all across the United States, both at airports and along marked aircraft navigation corridors, improving safety for visual flight navigation at night and in bad weather. At their peak in the 1950s, before the universal adoption of electronic navigation, tens of thousands of these towers dotted the American countryside from sea to shining sea, and so they were a natural choice for toy train manufacturers to add to their accessory lines. Lionel was the first to enter the rotating beacon market with the number 394 model in 1949. Standing almost 12 inches high, the metal tower was topped by a light housing that sat upon a special dimpled light bulb. Heat from the bulb would rise up and pass through a set of vanes cut into the light housing, causing the housing to rotate and display alternating red and green lights. The system was simple and mostly reliable. In 1950, as Lionel Trains celebrated its 50th anniversary, competitor American Flyer announced 50 new accessories for 1950. In order to create so many new products in such a short time, Flyer looked to outside companies to fill in the lineup. One of these companies was the Colber Corporation, an upstart that was gaining ground in the model train market by producing inexpensive versions of Lionel accessories. Colber was happy to help Flyer fill up their catalog by producing items for them. In 1951, one of the Colber items made for American Flyer was the Flyer number 769 rotating beacon. This all-plastic tower used the same dimple bulb-powered method as the Lionel number 394. For 1952 and 1953, the Flyer tower became the number 769A, featuring a new base with an added tool shed. The following year, Marx joined the beacon party with its own beacon. The Marx tower stood 11 3/4 inches tall, featured metal construction, and used the same dimple bulb and light housing method as the American Flyer and as the Lionel number 394. In fact, the Marx and Flyer bulbs and light housings are interchangeable, with some hobbyists preferring the Marx housing because it is lighter and thus rotates easier than the Flyer version. Obviously, with so many companies making the aircraft beacon, it was a popular accessory, but the design was not without its flaws. First, the beacon did not rotate immediately after receiving track power, but instead had to wait, sometimes several minutes, for the heat of the bulb to start rotating the beacon. Also, the wind-powered accessory was vulnerable to interference from any other wind movement in the room, whether a breeze from an open window or a blast from a nearby furnace. Delicate balance was also required, and if the accessory was not perfectly level, operation could suffer. To overcome these shortcomings, Lionel introduced the number 494 rotating beacon in 1954. Instead of relying on the heat from a light bulb, motion was created by using a vibrating motor and a rubber thrust washer, much the same as the number 3520 operating searchlight car. These remained in production through 1966. Now, back to my beacon. My tower is made of plastic, so that eliminated both Lionel and Marx as probable manufacturers. A quick search of images of the American Flyer beacon matched the colors and design of my tower, so I must have an American Flyer number 769 model, produced by Colber for Flyer in 1951. Case closed. All I needed then to make it operational would be a new dimple-type bulb and an appropriate beacon housing. I found reasonably priced reproductions on eBay that would work for either the Flyer or Marx versions. A few days later, the package arrived and I began to repair my tower. I removed the beacon housing to reach the light bulb socket, and something was very wrong. My new bulb, and in fact all of the replacement bulbs that I had seen, was a screw-in type, but the bulb base on my tower was for a bayonet type. It did not appear to have been altered in any way and must have been originally made that way. Strange. Then, below the bulb bracket, I saw something else out of the ordinary. A coil of wire. In fact, not just a coil of wire, but a vibrating solenoid. This was a vibrating beacon, not a wind power beacon, but it was made by Colber and not Lionel. I found an article about the American Flyer towers that said that around 1953, Flyer and Colber ended their working arrangement, and Colber began marketing the number 769 style beacon under their own name as the 116 mechanical rotating beacon. Wait, mechanical rotating beacon? That means there's a motor. I found another source that said the beacons that Colber made for American Flyer were all of the heat type, with a few rare exceptions, but all of them marketed under their own name were motorized. That was my answer. Colber began making the motorized beacons in 1953, a year before Lionel, and this is one of them. Colber repurposed the vibrating motors they used on their number 115 wigwag signal in 1952, another accessory that beat Lionel to the punch, and applied it to the rotating beacon. All I needed now was a BA9 bayonet base bulb, 10 to 12 volts should do, and I have plenty of those in my junk box. But there was still a problem. When I placed the beacon housing on my bayonet bulb, the bulb was too tall, and the beacon would not rotate. Since my beacon housing had fins in the top, I assumed that it was for an airtight beacon and not the original for my tower. But then I noticed a strange shadow on the lenses when I turned my beacon on. Investigating, I discovered the original beacon bracket was thrust into the housing. The bracket sits on a vibrating mechanism and secures the beacon housing well above the level of the light bulb. My Colber housing was designed to be universal, working with either type of mechanism. For the heat type, the pin in the center sits on the dimple of the bulb. On the mechanical type, the motion is provided by a separate bracket that sits on the thrust washer. The other end of the bracket clips inside the beacon housing to hold it in place above the bulb. The vent fins in this case simply serve to release the heat of the bulb and motor away from the accessory. The original thrust washer, which would have been attached to the beacon bracket, was missing, but I had ordered a few spare washers for my Lionel 3520 searchlight car, and this part is a perfect fit. Now I could just add an appropriate bulb. I chose a 12-volt version, and bingo, it worked.
And here it is, my Colber number 116 motorized rotating aircraft beacon accessory, not an American Flyer number 769. As I worked through the process of getting this tower back in operating condition, I learned a lot not only about the different manufacturers and their products, and I learned a lot about the Colber Corporation, an underdog New Jersey firm that, for a time, gave Lionel a run for their money in the accessory business. So what happened to Colber? Well, they started noticing that by 1953, 1954, their sales were starting to slump, and looking towards the future, they decided to move in directions other than toy trains, and eventually sold their tooling to Marx, who used it for the girder bridge, some street lamps, and perhaps a few other things. And meanwhile, Colber turned towards electronics parts manufacturing, and one of their biggest customers turned out to be Lionel, buying resistors for their smoke units. And in my research, I found another interesting toy train connection to the real rotating beacons. It turns out that many of the beacons made after 1950, particularly for airports and for Coast Guard stations, were made by Carlisle and Finch, the early toy train producer that I spotlighted last year. And so it would seem that every toy train piece has a story, and some stories are a lot more interesting than others. Many of these stories will take you to places that you didn't expect to go. What kinds of stories could some of the items in your train collection tell? Oh, and what about the dimpled bulb and replacement housing that I picked up? Well, at some point along the line, I'm sure I'll run across a early Lionel version or maybe a cheap American Flyer at a show. It just needs a bulb and a housing to get back in working order, and then I'll have two for my layout, one motorized and one bulb type. So keep the trains running, and we'll catch you next time with more toy train tips and tricks.